All right. Good. So nice to be back in person, though I wish the back in person had been over there and not over here. Maybe another time. We are learning Maseches Nazir Daf Nun Aleph, and we're starting on Nun Amud Beis, 2/3 of the way down at the 2 dots. And we've been discussing what are some of the things that would cause for a Nazir to become Tameh. And we have been somewhat graphic in the various body parts and iterations of body parts that would create tuma for a nazir. And one of the things that we discussed was a spoonful of the dust of a body after a body begins to decompose. And we are, for better or for worse, going to detail still more the graphics of what this actually means. And the Gemara says, "V'kama shiuro." What is the shiur for this tarvad, for this amount of body? Says the Gemara, "Chizkiya amar malo pisas hayad." Seems to be a palmful of body dust. I don't know what the right words are. Rabbi Yochanan amar malo chofnav. This should be a phrase that's familiar from Mishnayos. And malo chofnav, according to many, is 2 hands. That's malo chofnav b'yom kippurim. So that's what the Gemara says as malo chofnav machlokes in the Amoraim. And then the Gemara says it's not only Amoraim, seemingly in the Tanoim, also Tanan, we have a Mishnah. This Mishnah is found in the Tosefton Olos, Malo Tarvad Rekev Sha'amru. When the Chachamim said that there was a Malo Tarvad, that there's a spoonful or a heap of this body dust, that's Yeshno Me'ikar Etzba'os Ulemala, from the base of your fingers and onward. We don't know which direction yet. We're not sure if it's toward the wrist or is it toward the fingers, because very different amounts, because you can cup the palm of your hand much better than you can your fingers. And that's Tivir Rab Meir. Now, obviously, Bishlam Rav Yochanan, Hu Damar Kirabbanan, they both have the same language of Malochofnav. That's obvious. Elachizkiya, Kiman, Lo Kirab Meir, Velo Kirabbanan. Chizkiya, who says Mlo Pisas Hayad, that language is not reflected in the Shita of Rav Meir. So Chizkiya said Mlo Pisas Hayad. Rav Meir said, what was his language? Me Ikaretz Bo Sulamala. So Amri, the Gemara responds, okay, it's different phraseologies, but it actually means the same thing. No problem. It's the same exact shiur. How do you know it's from the base of your fingers to the ends of your fingers? Maybe you're wrong. Maybe it's not the same measure. It says the Gemara, Taka, we don't know what that shita is. Meaning, it's really a broader question of how this shita was even created in the first place. If the shita of Chizkiya is not found in the Tanaim, where did he get it from? Which is a reason to assume that he did find it in the Tanaim, but nevertheless, the Gemara accepts this question as a valid question and ends with a teku. Top of Nun Aleph, Amud Aleph. The Gemara says, Tanu Rabbanan, Ezehu meis sheyesh lo rekev. Not every mace on planet Earth qualifies for its body's dust to be rekev. Why? Because there are things that influence and there are things that infiltrate. Certainly the people that we bury in our community are buried in pine boxes. In due time, the wood rots away by all the moisture, and then animals can get in. Fine, so then that wouldn't count. We'll see right now. If a person is buried without clothing and they're buried in a marble casket, or they're buried in some type of solid stone, a cave of some kind. However, nikbar b'ksuso be'aron shel eitz o al gabe ritzba shel levanim. In all of these cases, zehu mei she'ein lo rekev. In other words, we have to make sure that there's no impurities in the rekev. Otherwise, we're going to assume that it's not going to be Matame the Nazir. So we're really asking a Nazir question. We have to remember, we have to come back out to the 30,000 feet. It's very easy to forget what we're talking about. How does a Nazir become Tame with a Tarvad Shel Meis? How does it work? A Rekev Shel Tarvad. So it has to be pure. It can't be with impurities at all. Amar Ula, another qualification to this din is Ein Rekev. When do we say that there's Rekev? That's only Ela Habamin Habasar Umin Hagidim Umin Ha'atzamos. It has to be comprised of these 3 things. So now we're getting much more limited, the possibilities of a Nazir becoming Tameh from a Tarbat Shel Rekev. Eisvei Rava Le'ula. There's a brisa. The brisa says Rekev Habamin Habasar Tahor. That's a brisa. The brisa says that Rekev, the dust of the decomposed body that comes from purely flesh, is tahor. What does that imply? Hamina etzem tameh. But what vafal gavdaleka basar? It implies that we only have some of the three ingredients. Says the Gemara, Emahachi, we should read it this way: Rekev haba min habasar tahor ad sheyesh etzem bebasar. We need both. Says the Gemara, wait 1 second, haleka gidim. We have three requirements. You're only talking about two. The Gemara says, as a halachic assumption, and maybe a biological one as well, efshar lebasar uleatzamos below gidim. It's not possible. We know scientifically as well that tendons and ligaments attach to muscles, and that's very likely not tendons, but ligaments attached to muscles, and that's a very likely assumption, and it's certainly a halachic one. So we don't assume that once you have bone and flesh, we assume that there's a gidim as well. Amar Rav Shmuel, more impurity aspects of Rekev. Amar Rav Shmuel bar Abba Amar Rav Yochanan. Shnei mesim shekavran zeim zeh nasu galgalim zelzeh. If two people are buried in the same exact burial plot, so then nasu galgalim, they're considered to be mixed with one another, and that will not be considered rekev. That will not be considered a tarbat shel rekev. So let's paint two distinct cases. One person buried in one place in the perfect marble coffin with no clothes, and he decomposes. The tarbat shel rekev, whatever the shiur is, tamei for a Nazir. Two people buried in that same place, no tarbat shel rekev. Okay, because there's impurities. Masi Rav Nassim, wait 1 second. We have another din, and we actually saw this already. Rekev habami beis mesim tamei. That's not true. So says the Gemara. No, Amar Rav Hasim shekabru zebifnei atzmo v'zebifnei atzmo. That's when they're buried separately, and then v'yarkivu v'amdu al malo tarbat rekev, and then their decomposing bodies combine underground, but they were not buried that way. They'd have to be buried in some unique way where each person is buried in their marble casket and then they spill into one another afterwards. Then that is going to be tamei. But if in fact they were buried together initially, so then when you're picking up that tarvad, that tarvad shel rekev, that's not considered to be tuma. Similarly, Amar Rabba bar bar Chana, Amar Rav Yochanan, when we're talking about impurities that are inside the kever, the Gemara says gazaz saro, if there are hair shavings, v'kivro imo, and it's buried with him, nasilo galgalan. That's also considered an impurity, even though it used to be part of his body. But now that it's no longer part of his body, so says the Gemara, that's no longer a din of tarbat shel rekev. That means if you take a scoop of that, he had a haircut and they put the hair in afterwards. I don't know who does that, but we don't do that. We don't cut people's hair. We don't cut people's nails. We leave it. So says the Gemara, that's the din. It's not Hassam. Wait 1 second. Kol shebemeis tamei chutz min hashinayim v'haser v'atziporen u'v'shas chiburan kulan tmein. The only time that we have this idea of kol shebemeis tamei is it excludes their hair, and the Gemara says, well, it's when they're chiburan, the kulan tmein. But if they're separated, then it's in fact an interrupter, and therefore it would not be considered tamei. By Chizkiah, sa'aro ha'omed legaleach. Let's say that the mace was supposed to get a haircut. Again, whatever the custom is, I don't know, but that's the Gemara's question. If he was supposed to get a haircut, or tziporin ha'omed ligazez, and he was supposed to get his nails cut, but he was buried without them getting cut, do we say that the anticipatory cutting counts as cutting? Do we say mi'amrinan kol ha'omed ligazez ki gazuz dami odil mahash damiha ha'mechubarin? Do we look at it as what theoretically should have happened, or do we say l'maisa they're still attached? This is a very halachic question, right? It's almost a lumdish question of how we treat. You had a haircut at 3, and then you're not around anymore. So then, how do we view that? So the Gemara says, why don't we say v'nifshal? We should learn this answer. We're a little bit more than halfway down, 2/3 of the way down on Nun Aleph. Amud Aleph says the Gemara, v'nifshal lemi de Rabba bar bar Chana. What did Rabba bar bar Chana say? Taima mishum de gazaz. Hello gazaz lo. Why make things complicated? The language that we had a couple of lines ago of Rabbi bar bar Chana was gazaz saro v'kavro imo nasilo galgalim. So that's gazaz. It's if it's gazaz, not if it's not gazaz. Says the Gemara, nohachi kamar. Really, the question is like this: gazaz, everyone agrees harezeh galgalim. Everyone agrees that if the hair is cut and is separate of the body when it's put in the kever, at least man depalig, everyone's going to agree that that's galgalim, and that the tarbat shel rekev would not apply in such a case. Lo gazaz mi boile. The only question is if it wasn't gazaz. A little subtle reframing of the question to say, of course, we know that if it's gazaz, that's pashut. That's obvious. The only question we're asking by is by lo gazaz, and the Gemara does not provide the answer. Miboile, the question remains. We're going to see a whole host of questions that don't get answered. Some of them do. Many of them don't over the next half of an amud. Boy revirmia rekev habamin ha'ekev mahu. What if the body's decomposition, turning to powder as the body decomposes, is from the heel? Why are we asking about the heel?
Skin.
A lot of dead skin. But frankly, we know scientifically all of our outer layer of skin, by and large, is dead skin. So we're going to discuss that a little bit more. But the akev is a very pronounced area of the body. What about our elbows? What about our knees? But certainly, and remember, we wear shoes. So like in a culture where they were wearing garbage shoes or walking straight on the ground, way more likely to have calluses. But even we have calluses. Fine. So it says the Gemara, Ki gamrinan rekev habami kule mes. Can it apply from the whole body? Aval da'asi mina akev lo, but it doesn't apply by the akev because that was dead already. Odilma loshna, or perhaps does it not matter? Tashma, let's see if we can bring an answer. Tashma detani Reb Nasim Reb Oshia, he brings a brisa. What does the brisa say? Short brisa. Rekev habami shnei mesen tame. If you have rekev from two bodies, they are tame. Lo zil then zil hacha dilma derech akev kaasi v'hacha dilma derech akev kaasi. If you're going to say that these two bodies that decompose together are tame, as we saw earlier, why aren't you excluding the heels? Must therefore be that the heels are no different than any other part of the body. But any other part of the body, says the Gemara, no. If we're talking about a whole body that is dying and decomposing, the person dies hachanami, I agree that the whole body would be tameh. We're only talking about one limb that is decomposing, and it's located near the feet. So then that's teku, that we don't know the answer. So really, we give credence to this question in the form of a teku. We don't really know the response in the Gemara as to whether or not a person's heel has a halachic difference when that one aver is what is decomposing. Next question, 6 lines from the bottom. Boy Rav Yirmiyah, Nebuch, Ubar b'mei isha. If a woman passes away with a fetus in utero, do we say that it's have galgalim, that they're two separate entities, and therefore, when the mother and fetus decompose, we would therefore say that it's not tarbat shel rekev because it's no different than two people? Oh, lo. Or perhaps would we say that they are considered one entity? Kevan de Amar Mar Ubar Yerech Imo. We've learned in earlier Masechtas. Where did we learn this? It says Tamura. I thought we had this in Shas already. Ubar Yerech Imo. Anyone? Oh, I thought we learned it in Shas earlier. Okay. Oh, I taught Tamura. Maybe that's why. I started. Rabbi Friedman left in September. Daf Yomi started in January, so we learned Tamura. Maybe we learned Tamura. Krisis? Is Krisis Tamura? I don't know. Yeah, but I don't even know what they're called anymore. I don't know. So the Gemara says we have a din of Ubar Yerech Imo, which has some certain halachic applications. So if we're saying Ubar is Yerech Imo, then Hilkach Kufahi v'lo have galgal, and it's really part of her. If it's part of her, then we don't treat the fetus as separate of the mother in the decomposition process. And then lo have galgalim, it's not going to be an impurity. It's all one body. Odilma kevan de sofo, let's say, is mifrash parish mina. Or do we say that since in anticipation of birth, we know that birth will then create a separation between the fetus and the mother? Do we therefore look at it as that, even though everything has stopped development because the mother passed away? Unknown. Even if you want to say ubar de sofo, let's say mifrash parishmina, and if you want to say on the very last line of the Aleph that really, yes, we view them as separate, and therefore it's galgalim, and therefore it's an impurity, and the tarbat shel rekev would not apply with a mother and her fetus. What about before the fetus is formed? Shechva zera b'mei isha mahu. What about finding shechva zera in the body, but not finding it, but knowing that there's shechva zera in the body? If she had tashma shemita before she died, would that be considered part of the establishment of having a child, and therefore the zera functions as one part of the body? Or no, Odilma, do we look at it as that possible separate ubar? In which case we would not. Mi amrinan kevan de lo itzar, because a child has yet to be created. Ki gufa dami, it's all part of her, just a part of her. Odilma kevan de me alma kaasilo, or because it's an external factor. It's not a fluid from her body. It's an external factor. Lo, so that's also an unanswered question. Nun Aleph Amud Beis, 3 lines down. Boira Papa Pirsha. What about fecal matter that's in the intestinal tract? Mahu. Do we say Kevan de lo mekaima b'delo achla? Since no one can survive without food, chiyuso, it's part of her. It's all one thing, and therefore it's not galgalin. It's therefore not two separate entities, and therefore all of the decomposition would count as tarbat shel rekev. Odilma hanami me alma asi, just like the zera, just like the shechva zera would be considered potentially separate of her body as an external addition, so too that which is in the intestinal tract is considered to be separate. Don't know. Boy Ravacha Bered Ravika Oro Mahu. What about skin? The Gemara's Havamina is that skin is not really considered part of the body. Fascinating Havamina. Take a look at Tosfos. Tosfos writes, Oro Mahu Sheyase Galgalan. So the Tosfos learns very clearly that or in the Havamina is not the same as the flesh, and that there's a distinction between them. No answer. Boy Rav Huna, back in the Gemara, Boy Rav Huna Bar Manoach, Kicho v'Niyah Ma, what about saliva? What about phlegm? All these questions of the fluids within the body. The Gemara doesn't ask about dam. I assume just the most fundamental assumption is that it's chiyusa.
And dam itself is matam.
If it's a revius of dam alone, right. But would it be considered galgalan? The Gemara doesn't even entertain the question. The Gemara doesn't even talk about it. So l'chora, it's chiyusa. The language of the Gemara before was chiyusa. Okay. Amar le Rav Shmuel.
It's not external. It really is completely internal. And what would be the other side to say that? I don't understand the skin question either. But
Yeah. I think our assumptions are biological in nature, and theirs are halachic in nature.
Are the external.
Correct.
Everybody is perishing in the system, but
the ubar is similar to blood. The ubar is similar. But again, it's its own discussion because ubar b'me'imo, ubar is yarach imo. It's potentially right. 8 lines down. Amar le Rav Shmuel bar Acha le Rav Papa. V'isal kadaitach kol hani teka amar have galgalan. If you want to say that all of these things that we saw, the shechva zera, the pirsha, if you want to say that all of these cases are galgalan, rekev demetame hechi mishkachas, then there's never a case scenario. Everybody dies with something in their stomach. What's a possible case scenario where a person could die and their body should then be shaykh to tarbat shel rekev? There's always going to be an impurity. Says the Gemara, Stan Gertz. Check this out. What did he do? He drank the Drano, but whatever it is, whatever the equivalent was. And not only that, but he put this lime all over the body, no hair left. And Vishalku b'meitzveria, and his body was put in the meitzveria, which is so hot. And even though we know it doesn't burn off, but it burns the skin in a way. What? Something like that. Again, biologically, we wouldn't have said this. We would have said that it cooked. We would have said something else. But either way, that would be a case scenario where we could have a case. Basically, tarbat shel rekev is becoming less and less likely over the course of this conversation. It has to be in a marble box. It can't have any impurities, even from its own body. Very complicated. But in this is Torah, the dakus halacha, is that when there is that rare case of tarbat shel rekev, that Nazir will be mamish tameh. Amar Abaye, we have a tradition. Naktinan, meis shetachnu ein lo rekev. God forbid a person's body gets ground up. No rekev, no din of rekev. Says the Gemara, I don't understand. Why? Tachanu v'chazer v'hirkiv ma'u. The body was ground up in some way, and then afterward it decomposed in a way where it generated rekev. Why would we not say that? Midi hu taima ela deika basar v'gidnu v'atzamos v'ha'ika. Okay, granted, everything is no longer like it used to be, but there still are the same body parts. If your concern was the prior requirement that it has to be basar, gidim, and atzamos, they're all present. Odilma, perhaps no. That's the only time we say that there's rekev is when the body is kibriyaso ba'in and beleka, is like the way God created it. But when the body decomposes not as God created it, then there is no rekev. That'll be a very limiting factor. If a person has a misa meshuna, they die in an uncommon way. Teku, we don't know. Next, Tni, halfway down. Ula bar chanina, meis shechasar. If there's a mace that has a missing limb, ein lo rekev, there's no din of tarbat shel rekev. And as well, below tfusa. Tfusa means connected to what is this talking about? That if there is a mace that has to be exhumed, so if any of the dirt that's in touch with the body is considered to be part of the mace, it has to be treated accordingly. But if they're missing a limb, then there's no din of tfusa by the dirt. And as well, if a body had some kind of amputation, v'lo shchunas kvaros, we typically assume that a cemetery, a halachic cemetery, has at least 3 mesim. But if one of the mesim is missing a limb, then it doesn't qualify for the din of shchunas kvaros. So that's what Ula said. Meisve, we have a brisa. Now, this brisa is unrelated we're only seeing part of a brisa, so it's going to be a little bit unclear. If we would have had time, we would have pulled the Mishnah from Edios. But the Mishnah says, lo, that's not true, not referencing our previous sentence, but the sentence that we can't see. Imamris b'meis sheyesh lo rov v'rova omelo tarvad reka. By a dead person, there could be a rov of the body, or a rova, a quarter of a kav of bones, or melo tarvad reka. Tomar bechai, when regards to someone who's alive, she'ein lo rov v'lo rova v'lo melo tarvad reka. But by a human being, there can't be such a case. It says Gemara, Hechi Dami, what are you talking about? By a human being, there's tarvad shel reka. He's alive. So it says the Gemara, Hechi Dami. No, the irkav, the arkiv chad aver, the chavase gabe meis. Afilu chad aver ikareka. Maybe there could be one limb gangrene. You have one limb. So how do we treat that? Is that a case which is halachically similar to a dead person, even when the person's alive? You have a person who really isn't. He's alive, but his limb is not alive, and it mamish decomposes. Is that tarvad shel reka by a living person? So the Gemara says no. Mikatani hames, we're actually missing a word here, and the Rivan adds it in 15, 20 lines from the bottom, halfway through the thick lines. Mikatani hadikavase b'mes. Your explanation of the brisa is great, but it's not what the brisa says. Rather, hakamash malan shum meis yesh lo rekav. A full dead body has a din of rekav. Shum chai ein lo rekav, and there's no such thing as a din of rekav by a human being. Even if he has gangrene, it doesn't matter. He's decomposing on the spot. It doesn't matter. That's not considered rekav. Boy, the Gemara asks, boy Rava, hirkiv kshehu chai. Let's say that his skin began to rot. The chazar b'meis mahu. It began rotting while he was alive, and then he died. But it rotted when he was alive. It just happened to be that he died now. So how do we view the rotting? If the rotting took place only before he died, and now his body is decomposing for secondary reasons, how do we view that rekev? Ki gmiri rekev, when we learned the tradition of rekev, is that only to irkiv kshehu meis, when the decomposition occurred only when he died. Odil mahashta miha hamais, or no, maybe it's dead already, and therefore it's still considered to be part of decomposition. Tashma, let's see. So we quote the same brisa from Edios that we saw before, lo. Imamers b'meis sheyesh lo rova sheyesh lo rov v'rova melo tarvad rekev tomar b'chai v'chule. What did we say over there? Taima mishum chai hameis yesh lo rekev. So the Gemara says and argues against this, tried to bring an answer. Miktani hameis, absolutely not. Same conclusion as before. Hakamash malan de shum meis yesh lo rekev. We only have a din of rekev by dead, and shum chai ein lo rekev. No one alive can have a din of rekev. And we would conclude that if the rekev began while he was alive and died, then that seemingly would not be the same din as if he was already dead. So that means that, let's say the limb dies and there's already a tarvad shel rekev, and then he dies, it doesn't count. We need decomposition to happen after he dies. So in those cases, the tarvad shel rekev can't be measured from that. It can only be from decomposition after death. So we would, if a Nazir picked up this, heaping spoons worth of decomposition from a dead man, but from a body part that decomposed while he was alive, he would not be tamei meis. But from another part of the body that decomposed, he would be tamei meis. Again, dakus halacha, all the way down to the molecules. It's incredible. I never want to be a dayan. It's terrifying to learn Gemara. It's terrifying.
And this is real.
If anyone was ever hesitating about Nazirus before Maseches Nazir, so you have enough fair warning.
Don't drive down Pratt.
Don't drive down Pratt. All the shailas about Tumas Ohel by the Goyim. I've told this story. I was driving Yosef Schwartz's kid to baseball, and I drove on the opposite side of the street. I didn't know a communist or derais. He was a katan at the time. Now he's a gadol. But it's a suffix because of the suffix of the Tuma by a Goy. Okay, 3 lines from the bottom. We're going to be...
Doesn't matter, does it?
Huge difference. By a Jewish cemetery, it's Vadai Tuma. It's Vadai Tuma.
No, it's
the one by Todd Hall?
What?
Yeah.
I did not know that.
The one right by.
So, fruit people are buried? Didn't even know.
Some.
Brad and.
East Prairie. I think it's East Prairie.
Yeah.
It's the school there on the corner.
They were dying to go to school.
Wow, I did not know. It's tiny. It's a small place.
Couple sisters.
Oh my gosh.
His sister.
Wow. Glad I drove on the wrong side of the street. Mamish Usher.
That's not real.
Yeah.
What do you tell a police officer?
What?
What do you tell a police officer?
God's more important than you are. Although he probably wouldn't appreciate that. So, okay. We're going to be jumping. We're going to extract from here to a slightly different sugya. Boy Rava, if what we've learned so far is true, Nimala, if a person eats an ant, but shechasra, one of its legs is missing, mahu, what's the din? Now, we know, of course, that ants are not a shiur proper because they're tiny. They don't fill kazayas. So the din is that that there's a halacha that when we have something called a beria, when you have something that is very small but it is complete, so then that's an isur daraisa. So we've learned in other places in Shas, if you eat a bug, you violate a whole host of isur, and that's only if it's a full bug. So do we say shiura gemirin la v'hachasir? I need to eat the whole ant and it's missing a leg. O beria gemiri la v'ha'ika, or is this considered a beria? Why is it still considered a beria if it's missing a leg? So take a look at Tosfos all the way at the bottom. O dilma beria gemiri v'havi lasheretz hol ve'adayin re'uya l'chios. Since it's still a beria, because even if that spider is missing a leg, it can still walk. I didn't know that until I saw this Tosfos. Beria is not defined by complete; it's defined by functional. It's defined by living, even though it's not complete. That still is a din of a beria. I didn't know that. You know, when you were kids, maybe when you were adults, you put honey out, and the bee comes in, and the body like slowly breaks into pieces. So if only one leg, that's still a beria. And if it's not, if it mamish falls apart, then it's not a beria anymore. I didn't know that. So that's the Gemara's Chakiras. It says the Gemara top of Nun Beis. We'll stop at the 2 dots in about 8 lines. Amar Rabbi Yehuda midiskarta Tashma. We have a brisa. In regards to shratzim, we have 2 parts of the psukim that seem to say different things. First of all, it says bohem yachol bekulan. You might have thought the whole animal. No, Talmud Omar mehem. It says the Gemara. Well, imehem yachol miksasan. If you thought the whole one, then maybe only part. Talmud Omar bohem. This is a very cyclical type of logic, and it creates this difficult question of haketzad. What is this scenario of whole but part? It says the Gemara. We're talking about a case of touching a sheret, which is only a part of an animal, that is equivalent to a whole animal. What is that? It's an amount of a sheret that's the size of a ke'adasha, it's a very small one, a lentil. And the Gemara says, Shekain hachomet, when we're talking about these kinds of animals in their embryonic phases, tchilas b'riyasok b'che'adasha. They are only considered to be life at this size. So when a sheretz is at this size, it can be metame, even though it's only part of an animal. So this is the blend of it counts as a whole animal, even though it's only part of an animal. Shma mina, shiura gemirila, and therefore the Gemara says that ant would be considered chaser, and it would not be a din of a beria. Amar of Shmaya, ki ba'inan, when we ask this question, ki ba'inan shiura de lo havya ke adasha, lo metame de lo nafla banashama. Are we saying that there is no neshama there? Aval nafla banashama, but if in fact we see that the larva, whatever it is, starts moving around, now all of a sudden it's alive, tibaylach, we don't know the answer to that. So that's what the Gemara says in all of these cases. In short, it is very difficult to fulfill the isser of a Nazir becoming tummy with malo tarbat shel rekev. It's very, very difficult with all the qualifications, with very little room for interruption and impurities. Even if he's wearing tachrichen, you're done. You're done, because if it falls apart, the only exclusion would be is if the tachrichen are in perfect form and everything else is decomposed. Okay, fine. But otherwise, it's very, very difficult to violate this isser. And the way to avoid it entirely is to not become a Nazir. We'll stop right here and pick up Emir Hashem tomorrow night with a blot and a half. Nice to see you all in person. Wishing you all a beautiful night.